Hi, Bob. First off, just give us your name and your role here in St. Genevieve.
My name is Robert Mueller. I go by Bob. My role here is I'm kind of a local historian. I've been past president of the Foundation for Restoration of St. Genevieve and just very much interested in the history of St. Genevieve, the
My,
whole history of St. Genevieve.
my name's Tim Good. I work with the National Park Service, part of the initiative to establish a national park here in St. Genevieve. And one of the Park Service's initial aims was to have a recording of Bob and his knowledge and his expertise. This could not only help visitors coming to St. Genevieve, but also the National Park Service staff here, so they can learn at least some of what you've gathered over a few years of studying this topic. So if somebody was to ask you, Bob, what is important about St. Genevieve, how would you answer that question?
I think what's really important is it's probably got the best collection of the very unique French vertical log architecture. Um, and you're just not going to find houses like this anyplace else in the United States. I mean, there are several other ones like down Natchitoches or at Pascagoula, Mississippi, but the concentration of vertical log houses that date from 1790 to 1840s, more or less, is just very, very unique.
And how many French vertical log houses would you say St. Genevieve has?
That's a hard one to answer. I think we say around 25 to 30, but we continuously find houses that look like a 1920s bungalow that when you take the siding off, here's some vertical logs in the construction.
And for those that are not familiar, how would you describe a vertical log house?
Well, you know, the Americans adopted the Swedish style where there was horizontal logs notched on the end, and they built their house up that way. The French architecture actually came, Charles Peterson, a famous uh, architect who started the HABS, or Historic American Building Survey, back in the 30s, really started trying to understand where we got our architecture. And it's kind of a mix of architecture that came from Normandy and Brittany, France, which where most Canadians came from, to Canada, and then it migrated down here to what was known as the Illinois country, the Pas-de-Illinois. And here it was a different climate than it was in Quebec and Montreal. It's rainier, just a lot more moisture, it's a lot more humid, so our houses typically had galleries or porches built around them, and that's a Caribbean influence. So it's kind of well, and there were French influences down in the islands too, because France had a number of islands down there, so it was kind of the trade. We kind of understood what they were doing with their galleries. So I think that's what's really unique about St. Genevieve.
And when would you say St. Genevieve was founded?
Well, that's like most things, being first or oldest or whatever. It's kind of difficult because they just didn't come and plant a sign that said, "We are a city." People from across the river had been coming over here for years, primarily to make salt. We had salt springs just south of town. Came over here to hunt, but farming kind of was the thing that drove most of the early settlers over here. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of the records that we'd like to see, there's no longer in existence, such as the Kaskaskia church records. There's a gap in what's available right around that 1735 to 1750 time period, which we could maybe get mentions of St. Genevieve. So, I mean, we say sometime in the 1740s when it started to have a population of, more than one or two houses, and it was a consistent year-round living rather than coming over to make salt and then going back to the Illinois side of the river.
So by 1750, what would you say the population of St. Genevieve was?
Well, we know exactly what it was in 1752 because the first census, and there were 23 people here, including 3 enslaved people. Probably the most famous or the largest family was the Desgard de la Rose family, and he was kind of the captain of the militia because he had all the powder and everybody had guns. There were, I think, 158 pigs. It detailed how many horses, how many female horses. It's just a wonderful census for that time period. So we know who some of the really early settlers were. There were a couple of them, I think, were ex-soldiers from Fort Deschartres. And then there were families that had lived across the river and had moved over here.
Do we know how many buildings were in St. Genevieve in 1752?
Probably, probably less than 11.
Okay.
Because, I mean, just knowing the groups and then the family, you know, they listed how many children were under age of being able to carry a gun, because it was important for self-defense.
Sure.
Young females, and so they had all of that listing, but you know that there were some family units there to make up the houses, so there really weren't that many of them.
And what was the town named for?
Well, the town is named St Genevieve, and St Genevieve is a French female saint who helped save Paris by praying, and when Attila the Hun was going to ransack Paris, and he made a left turn and went down and ransacked Orleans. But she was well known in Paris, the patron saint of Paris. The French loved her, and so they named this little town after her. Now, our church was actually called St. Joachim, probably until about 1769, and then it became the parish of St. Genevieve.
Oh, I didn't know that. So, well, since you touched on the Catholic Church influence, can you just give us a brief history of their influence throughout the 1700s here?
Well, I think it all started with the black robes that came down from Canada to try to, you know, bring Christianity to the Native Americans, and they founded places like Cahokia, 1799. They had down at Kaskaskia, that was a group of Jesuits that had been in Carondelet, Missouri, for a year, and then decided that wasn't working out, so they went down and founded Kaskaskia. And you know, Cahokia was founded about the same time Philadelphia was founded. So, I mean, at the same time that all of the history that we learned in school about the 13 colonies, there's this other group of people that are in the Midwest, and they're predominantly Catholic. The Jesuits were here until 1763, when they were kicked out of France and out of New France. But then we always had priests that were here. They covered wide territories. In fact, even as late as almost 1800, the priest here was covering from St. Louis all the way south for a distance. He married not only Catholics but non-Catholics. So what happened was the 7-Year War, 1756 to 1763, and in 1762 the King of France saw that he was losing, so he decided to do a secret treaty with his cousin King Charles of Spain, and he gave all the land west of the Mississippi that France had to the Spanish. And the Spanish were very Catholic also, and so our history has always been a strong Catholic presence here. We kind of talk a lot today about our immigration situation. Well, in the 1790s, to go from the American side, the east of the Mississippi, to settle in the western side, which was Catholic, under the King of Spain, you had to profess to be Catholic.
I know that.
So, I mean, it was strong. Early writers talk about how the French here didn't want to change very much. If it was good for their father and grandfather, it was good for them. And also, they remarked on the people's love for their church. And when you look at the civil, or the people in power, there were really three in the early stages. It was the captain of the milice, the commandant, and the Catholic priest.
Since you mentioned the other two, can you describe what their duties would have been, captain of the milice?
Yeah, the captain of the milice were our first citizen soldiers. When we never had French Marines over here like they had over at Fort Deschartres. When the Spanish came in control about, I think it was 1769 or so, they finally sent like 8 Spanish soldiers here. And the commandant would have been in charge of those soldiers. And they had a military background. Rocheblav, one of the first ones, that was a retired officer from Fort Deschartres. Other ones like Louis Villars and The Oro were members of the Fixed Regiment of Louisiana. One was an artillery guy, one was a grenadier. So they had that part of it. The captain of the milice was the kind of the home guard, and citizens that were men that were between 15 and either 55 or 60 that could carry a gun had to be members of the militia or milice. And they would practice on Sundays how to drill and everything. They never did get called out too often, other than the famous British raid on St. Louis in May 1780. So, and there was one other time they got called out, but they were the home guard, and the Catholic priest was the one that tried to keep the morals of the community in check. And there's some famous stories about one Frenchman living with a woman who he wasn't married to, and the priest tried to have a meeting with him, and the guy kept blowing the priest off, and finally the priest writes a letter to the commandant or the captain of the milice. I can't remember which one it was, but pretty soon they end up getting married.
Showing the influence of the priest.
Yeah,
on
yeah,
like
very
that.
much so.
In terms of St. Genevieve's history, obviously the flood, would you consider that a major point in
Well,
history?
it's like most river towns. They built the initial town about 2 miles from the present town, right on the river. There were no roads. We didn't have a road until about 1770 to St. Louis, and it was really not a road, it was a path.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't, to move around, they did it on the river. And so the land that they built on was very fertile, because we had all the soil coming down from the floods that you mentioned from Iowa and Nebraska. And I think one guy wrote, he said it flooded 2 out of 5 years.
Wow.
And there had been several disastrous floods. The river tends to change its banks. You had these cut banks and everything, and it started to encroach on the town. 1785 was a huge flood. Supposedly it went to the top of the houses, up to the chimneys. And the story was that Shudo came down in his boat and ate his breakfast tied to a chimney in the old town. And that precipitated a move to what we call Les Petites Côtes, the little hills. The lowest area is still pretty low.
Right.
And it took a number of years for that migration to happen. In fact, the church stayed down there until 1793, when they started to move it up to the new town. And so it just didn't happen all at once that they had this migration to the new town.
But by 1800, the old site would have been
Pretty much abandoned.
okay,
Yeah.
and the new site would have been flourishing.
Right.
Okay. Go ahead.
Well, actually, there was the district of, under the Spanish, there were 5 districts in Upper Louisiana. There was St. Charles, St. Louis, St. Genevieve, which went from the Merrimack down to the Apple Creek, and then you had Cape Girardeau and New Madrid, which went all the way down into present-day Arkansas. Well, in the 1790s, a Frenchman came here with a great title, Pierre Charles de Delessus de Louzière, and he had fled France because of the revolution over there, and he ended up here. But he was a friend of the governor down in Louisiana, so they carved out a small district just south of town here called Nouvelle Bourbon, New Bourbon, and it had its own militia and that sort of thing. So there was kind of a six district, but he and the commandant here in St. Genevieve worked very close together. We see a lot of correspondence between the two of them.
Very good. So, since you mentioned other residents, there were some that were coming from the Caribbean that settled here. Is that accurate?
A few.
Okay.
We're blessed to have other inventories. We're blessed to have an inventory of our militia in 1779, and it not only lists the name, it lists their occupation and where they were born. And I think there was one guy from the Canary Islands. There were a few from France. That most of the people that had come here were French Canadians. There was I think 15 English are Americans that had come across the river. There was a German brewer that made beer, a hat maker. I mean, it's just a variety of people. And I guess when I look at St. Genevieve, it wasn't purely French all the time. It was a French town, it was a French language, but you had a confluence of different cultures coming here. You had the French Canadians, you had the true Frenchmen, you had Americans that had moved across the river, you had African Americans, you had Native Americans. It was, and they all, you know, documents were still in French or in Spanish during the Spanish period, but it was a French town, but a confluence of cultures.
So would you say the majority of those that settled here initially were from French Canada?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They had come down the rivers and had lived in Kaskaskia or Prairie du Rocher or the other little villages like St. Anne, St. Philippe, and they came over here to farm, actually. The land over there was getting more filled up with habitants, farmers, and so I think one of our earliest records was the captain or the commander at Fort Deschartres gave a guy named Hunol a land grant in St. Genevieve. And so it was, there were really four things that they did here. Some of these were very seasonal. You had the salt making. We had springs just south of town that were very saline with a high saline content. In fact, the river is called La Saline on most of the maps. In fact, the earliest writing I've ever found about our area was Joutel. It's about 1680. He was the second in command for La Salle, and he wrote about those springs. So that was one of the first things that they did. They had to preserve their food, their meat, with salt, so they came over here. The other seasonal occupation was mining lead, and that started as early as 1720. A guy named Philippe Renault got a concession to mine lead here. It was during that the Mississippi bubble, that the John Law. I mean, it was just a time when France was trying. They wanted to be like Spain. They thought they would find silver here, and like in Potosi in South America, but they found lead, and that became one of the big commodities, and that was a seasonal thing where they would go out and mine lead. It was very crude. It was surface mining. Smelting was very, very crude. Just pile a bunch of logs in a pit and put the lead on top, light it on fire, and so it really wasn't a very efficient way to get the lead ore out of the ground. But this was one of the biggest lead mining areas in the world here. I mean, just west of here, between 20, 30 miles. The other thing is they trapped furs, obviously, and did that. We had a lot of the guys that were listed in that 1779 militia were voyageurs. So they were the ones that paddled the river, went down to New Orleans, paddled up to Montreal and Quebec. We know in the 1750s we actually sent wheat up to the forts near Detroit in Ohio. We obviously sent a lot of wheat down to Natchez and New Orleans, sometimes Mobile, because they couldn't grow wheat and flour. Wheat, that's the one thing the French really loved was their bread.
Sure.
We always laugh. St. Louis was founded about 1763, right at the end of that 7-Year War, and they always had a nickname. The French were great on nicknames, but they called St. Genevieve Misère, misery, and we called them Pancourt, which meant short of bread, because we were always shipping flour up to them to feed them.
So if I was to walk down a street in St. Genevieve in 1800, I would predominantly hear French being spoken.
Predominantly French being spoken. In 1800, we had about 1,000 people here. Wow. At the end of the French and Indian War, it caused a lot of people to move, French-speaking people to move from the east side of the river to the west side of the river. They did not really like the Americans or the British, and they thought they were vulgar and fought a lot and drank whiskey and that sort of thing. And the Americans didn't think much of the French. They thought they were kind of lazy and superstitious because of their adherence to religion, and but we eventually all got along.
Now, you mentioned the importance of agriculture to St. Genevieve's history. To this day, in the common field, you still have agricultural use.
Yes, it was called Le Grand Champ. It was about 7,000 acres. It's an alluvial plain. The French used that to farm. Their primary crops were wheat and corn, though they did some other things. We see flax being grown and a little bit of cotton, but it was primarily wheat and corn. And it's very fertile soil because it still floods at times today, even though we've tried to build some levees to keep it out. It's really hard to control that river. It has a mind of its own, and sometimes it wins.
And describe the French land pattern that they developed there, which was not typical for English or American.
No, it wasn't. It had some aspects of some Canadian. If you went to Canada near Quebec, they would have, or Montreal, they would have a seigneurial system, which is like a main landowner, and he would rent out land, and it would all go to the water. It was long, narrow lots. And that long lot architecture for farming was very prominent here. They built a fence from the river all the way around the area that they were farming, and people would get 1, 2, or 3 arpents wide sections of land that went from the fence all the way to the river. An arpent's about 193 feet. And they did it for 2 reasons. And the first was that everybody had access to water then, which was the mode of transportation. And 2, the French had an archaic way of plowing. They had a wheeled plow, and they used oxen hooked to the horns, not to the necks of the oxen. And I always say an oxen's like us Germans, and I can say it because I have 100% German heritage. Once you get them going in one direction, it's hard to turn these things, and so that's why they would plow on long lines, and they would delineate the lines with pecan trees or stones or whatever, and people were responsible for their section of the fence, and it had to be in good working order in early April. And then the town elected a guy called the syndic, and one of the few elected positions in town, and his job was to go out and inspect the fence. And once he said it was okay, they went in and planted their crops, and they closed the gates, posted a guard, and I always said they sang, drank, played cards, and told stories for the rest of the summer. Didn't weed, went in the fall and harvested their crops.
Since you mentioned your German heritage, can you give us a progression in respect to how the St. Genevieve population changes over time? Because you said it starts out French,
yes,
but and you can tell us by 1850, 1870, whatever, it has changed due to immigration.
Yeah, and it started changing, around 1804 after the Louisiana Purchase. We start seeing more American influence in the building here. In fact, a guy named Henry Breckenridge, who actually was sent here to learn French as a 7-year-old in the early 1790s, wrote a book later in life about his coming to St. Genevieve, his living here, and one of our vertical log houses is still here that he lived in. But he came back in 1811, and he said you could start to see the American influence in the architecture of the town. And we had Germans here before that, singularly. We had a German doctor in the 1770s. We had the German brewer was here for a number of years, though his name was Franz Kuhlmann from Bavaria, but they gave him a French name, Francois Coman. So, but actually, thank goodness he made beer. About 1800, we had a few, the Bircher brothers that came in and were stonemasons. 1820, we had like can't remember their name all of a sudden, but they came in and ran tobacco stores. But it really started about 1832. We started getting a migration of Germans, mostly from southern Germany, all the way, mostly from the Black Forest and what was called the Duchy of Baden. We had some from Swabia, some from Bavaria, but most of them from Baden. And that area is very, everybody asks, why did they come here? It's very similar. Baden, the Black Forest is right along the Rhine. There's an alluvial plain that they farm. So, I mean, it was kind of like home. But when they got here, the French had all the good land in the around the river and on the alluvial plain. So the Germans and the Americans that came here tended to be further west of town in what is becoming the foothills of the Ozark Mountains. So it's hilly, it's rocky, it's a lot different. And they learned how to farm it using more modern techniques. But from 1832, when the first major migration started, 1848 was another time period. There was a revolution in southern Germany, and they brought the Prussians in to try to retain order and shot a few, and it was a big migration. And so we saw that migration all the way up to about 1880 to 1900. But that time period from about 1745 to 1845 to 1860 was just huge in terms of German migration, and most of them were Catholic.
I was going to ask you, so is the Catholic aspect of the town part of what's attracting them as well?
Yes.
Okay.
And so they came here. Our church, we had a wooden vertical log church in the new town that was the last of the vertical log churches in the old town. That was built in 1794. By 1832, it was too small, it was falling apart, so they built a stone church. And then by 1875, 1876, that church was too small, so they built the present church, which is almost as big as a cathedral. I mean, it's a very magnificent edifice here in town.
So when would you say St. Genevieve was no longer a majority French?
I'd say it was starting in the 1840s,
so
50s.
Up to 1840, it's majority French.
You start seeing less and less of the French. The Americans that came in settled pretty much in the west end of the county, was the present county. In fact, the area is called New Tennessee, so you know, you just you know that's where they were at. So and it was a changing, but the town stayed pretty much Catholic. The physical town of St. Genevieve until probably, you know, in the 1980s, it was starting to change significantly.
And what percentage of the current population would you say are French descendants?
Well, it's kind of hard to say because they eventually, some of them intermarried with Germans. Not a lot at first, and with Americans, and unless people trace their background, you know, they really don't know. But I think the 2000 census said that in the county, 40% of the people felt they were of German heritage, and only 12% felt they were of French heritage.
That explains a lot.
Yeah.
You mentioned before the relationship between St. Louis and St. Genevieve. How much agriculture was occurring around St. Louis as compared to here?
Well, there was some of, you know, I mentioned the battle in St. Louis in May 1780, and most of the people who were killed had been out in the fields working or picking strawberries or whatever. They had a different situation there. They were near the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi. They were on high ground, not subject to flooding. You know, they developed significantly faster than St. Genevieve did. I think we were both about 1,000 in 1800, but they kept growing as the fur trade in that time period really took off. St. Louis really took off too. But as I said, a lot of times in the early years, we'd have to send wheat up there for them.
And originally, St. Louis would have been built with French vertical log buildings as well.
Oh yes, I mean down by the riverfront where Jefferson National Park, Memorial Park is, there were probably lots of vertical log houses. It was just the French style, and they disappeared when they built the warehouses for the steamboat era. And I think when they were building the new bridge, one of the archaeologists found the remnants of a post-in-the-ground house that had been built there. So I mean, we know they had those kind of houses.
So what may have helped St. Genevieve in terms of historic preservation was a lack of development as opposed to what we saw in St. Louis.
That's correct. Okay. Yeah, and for instance, our population now is pretty much the same as it was in 1950 here in the town. Back then, most families had 5 or 6 kids. Now we have, fewer kids, and so we have more houses and everything, but the population stayed pretty consistent. The county's been growing, but the city itself hasn't.
And that's not uncommon for historic preservation, where you have not had development. Typically, you have your gems of history preserved that way. Where you have massive development, remnants do not remain.
Well, I think the other thing that happened is people continued to live in these houses. They didn't tear them down. They might divide them into apartments or whatever, and up through about 1950, most of these houses were still owned by families that had descended from the original settlers. So, having the fact that people lived in them, but on the other hand, it's just another house to a lot of residents
Right.
here, rather than some very unique architectural treasure.
And still, people live in them today,
Oh yes, oh yes.
and as residences. As a
Yeah,
primary residence.
the one that little boy lived in, the Vital St Genevieve house, built in 1792, and he came probably within 2 years after that was built. He described the house, the Mr. Beauvais and food and stuff, so it's a great reference for us, but that's still a private home and very livable.
Now, you mentioned the American architecture that starts to be seen here in St. Genevieve. How was that different from the French architecture that was already here?
Well, I think you can see like the old brick house and the Southern Hotel, those are the 1804, 1805, 1808 kind of time periods. They're made out of brick with more conventional kind of structures. You have the 1818 Valley Menard House, which was built by Philip Jacobson, a Jewish guy from St. Louis. It was both a mercantile store and a home, but it's a federal style house. I mean, you just see it and you recognize that it's a different architecture. The Germans coming in, you can recognize a lot of their vernacular structures by the way they're built, and a lot of brick. And that's something that the French just didn't do. I think, they used stone, very few full stone houses. I think there's only 1 or 2 that we know about in St. Genevieve, but St. Louis had them, like Shudo's house, I think, was an all-stone house. The French in the Old Town did mostly post and ground houses, and those tend to rot away after a period of time. Though, guys, we do have a building contract for Louis Bolduc in the Old Town, I think about 1771, and it was for what we call a post or soul house, or post on a limestone foundation. And when you get to the new town, we're closer to the bluffs and closer to the limestone, where you wouldn't have to cart it all the way across that Le Grand Champ to get to the Old Town. You see fewer post in the ground houses, and you're seeing these post on sill houses.
Yeah, and I didn't ask you this, but please explain, what's the difference between a post on sill and post on ground? These
Well,
are the 2 types of French
yes,
vernacular difference.
Yeah. And the rarest that we have here is the plateaus en terre house, and that means post in the ground. They would dig a trench, and the vertical walls would be buried all the way down 5 or 6 feet in the ground, and then filled in around them. The floor would be on a separate piers and be kind of a floating floor. And because they are underground and termites, there's very few of those left in the United States. In fact, there's only 5 that we know about. There's one in Natchitoches, Louisiana, the Baden Roque House. Down in Pascagoula, Mississippi is the LaPointe Creb House. And in St. Genevieve, we have the Amaro, the Becket-Ribaud, and the Vital St. Genevieve. So we have the highest concentration of vertical post in the ground houses left in the United States. The other style is called plateau sur sol, or post on a sill. And those you have a limestone foundation, put your bottom plate on, then you have the vertical post mortised into the bottom plate and the top plate.
And there's dozens of those.
There's dozens of those.
In St. Genevieve. When the Germans began to enter into St. Genevieve, did they tend to stick to themselves, or was there an instant interaction with the French residents?
Well, they had they had to have some interaction with the French here in town, but they farmed little villages around St. Genevieve, the town of St. Genevieve. About 5 miles outside of town is a little village called Zell. And then there's another one called New Offenburg, and another one a little further out called Weingarten or Weingarten. And they're all named after just a little small area near Offenburg, Germany. There's the big city of Offenburg. About 7 or 8 miles away is a town called Zellweierbach, which is where a lot of people came from here. And in the middle was a church called Weingarten Church. And so we have, and when you go to those, and I've been there, into their cemeteries, their Friedhofs, it's like reading our phone book. I mean, it's the same names. So, and there, as I said, there wasn't a lot of intermarriage between Germans and the French at first. Followed on later that there was. I think Art Papen's parents or grandparents, he has stories about how his German ancestor was kind of looked down upon when he kind of came to court the French girl.
Sure. Describe the Norman Trust system and how that is pertinent to St. Genevieve.
Again, this is part of that migration of architecture from Normandy, France to Canada to here. And it's I guess you could call it a king post truss in some planes, but then it has a lot of, on the horizontal trend, it has a lot more different kinds of beams and supports and everything. A lot of the houses were hipped roofs and then had the galleries all around, and that causes a lot of other things to support the roof of the porch that you have to put in. They vary here. Different builders built them different ways. And even after we became American, they were still building those. The Jacques Board House has some marvelous Norman trusses that you can go up and see, and they're very heavy. They're made out of oak, pinned together with wooden pegs, and they're really designed to hold a thatched roof. Thatch, you keep piling reeds or something on the roof, and every time it rains, that gets heavier and heavier. So you need a strong structure to hold all of that weight. And we actually have records in the old town of houses with shingles and barns with thatch on them. So we know they used both of those styles. I think it was a 1766 deed, and I was surprised that they're using shingles, Bordeaux at that time, but they were. And
so if I went through Normandy, France today, would I find some examples of the truss system there that are similar to what we find here?
not so many houses, but in barns and things like that. Jim Baker, who used to be the superintendent of the state park here, went to France and he went looking for these. And he went to I think, Pas d'Ouage, the area of France, and he found vertical log barns and stuff that were still there.
And again, that would have been the same architectural technique there.
Right.
And how old were those buildings?
Well, those were probably even older, you know.
By
Here in
hundreds of
America, we
years,
think
perhaps.
something's old at 200
I know.
years. I mean,
But I mean, so they may have been there for hundreds of years before.
Yeah.
But that technique eventually immigrated, to
Right.
the United States, which we see here.
and we kind of, people are looking at the joinery of wood and how it's done in Canada and how it's done here and how it's done down in Louisiana. And what are the differences? And it's a whole area, I think, of research that is interesting to see how that changed. And we know that a number of our houses were actually built primarily by enslaved people, so they had to have some talent to put these together. But they used some very unusual joinery. I mean, some of these are sophisticated joints that they put together to make these Norman trusses.
And have survived for 200 years.
And the New Madrid earthquake of 1811.
Well, explain a little bit why a French vertical log building is less susceptible to earthquake damage.
Well, one of the things, the New Madrid earthquake, the force of it went up primarily up the Ohio Valley. It was about an 8 on the Richter scale. In New Madrid, it was about a 6 here. And from the records we have, it primarily affected stone chimneys and brick chimneys and that sort of things. But the French style, and I've always wanted to work with a university to take a French style house and subject it to different kinds of rolling waves and things that happen during earthquakes to see if it really is stronger. But they had a lot of bracing. You know, you have in a modern balloon style construction, you know, you might have 16-inch centers. Well, there might be 3 vertical log posts in that same 16 inches in a French house, and they're going to be 4 by 4 or 6 by 6, and they're oak and they're strong. So I think that helped the French houses, but it's another one of those areas where I'd love to study and see were they truly better.
You mentioned oak. Was that the predominant wood that was used in these houses?
Well, you'll find oak in terms of structures. Like the jockey board, the trusses are all oak. The rafters are a mixture of cedar and pine. We had a lot more pine back then in our area than we do now, but you know, the hardwoods were always there, the hickories, the oaks, and we had people that came through here, they list all the trees, and so it's.
But now, you would not use a pine tree for a vertical log, though?
No.
Okay, you're going to use a hardwood.
Well, they might. You know, sometimes we wonder why did they last so long, and
Right.
were they made out of cedar, or did they do something different, like charring the ends that made them less susceptible to termites? Cedar's got some natural protection about that, but I mean, we don't see. I have to go back and look at all the posts in the ground houses, but which ones we had here, but that whether they had any cedar in there.
But predominantly oak would
Yeah.
be the wood they use. Explain the material that they would use in between the vertical logs.
So we see various spaces between the logs. I mean, it can be sometimes an inch, sometimes 3 inches. We even see where they made the inside surfaces of the logs concave, like down at the Beauvais Amaro house. But they would fill it full of a mixture of clay, horsehair, and straw, and a variety of other things. It's called bousillage. And they would pack that in there, and then they would tend to whitewash the buildings. People commented on how white the town looked when they came in. It was because of white. I mean, we have more limestone here than I mean, some of our biggest industry is rock right now. And we have a lime plant that's over 100 years old, and so that was readily available.
For the whitewashing.
For the whitewashing. And so that's what kind of was their insulation. And we see all kinds of things. We see rocks in there sometimes with clay. It's called periotage. We see, John Carroll has this little cabin, and they had saplings split on the inside. So different is if you move down to Louisiana, you see a lot more use of Spanish moss and bousillage kind of used in their houses.
So they're being very pragmatic in
Yeah.
terms of what materials are available to fill in the space between
Right.
those. So if you were walking through St. Genevieve in 1800, what do you think would surprise most Americans today in terms of what they would see or what they would experience?
Well, the fact is that it was all mud roads, and they didn't have sewer systems and that sort of thing, and pigs and cows roamed the street and stuff like that. Most of the houses were surrounded by a stockade to keep animals from getting in. I never did finish answering your question about what the differences was between the French and English.
Oh, please go ahead.
You know, the English like to have their 40 acres and their nearest neighbor a mile away or something. Well, the French were more communal. They had their house in town. It typically had an outdoor cook station, a well, maybe an oven in the Quebec style. Behind that would be a garden, a vineyard, an orchard. It was one guy described it as a microcosm of a little farm. There was an area just outside of town called the Common Park, and that's where they let the cattle roam and they cut firewood and that sort of thing. And then they had their lot down in the big field. So it was really 3 areas that they operated in, as opposed to the 40 acres of the Americans. But I think if somebody walked down that street in 1800, he'd see a lot of whitewashed buildings, he'd see a lot of stockades. We have some description of Thomas Ashe came through here in 1806, and he talked about hearing the bells of the church long before he got to town, and he said you could hear the local swings telling love stories on the porch or you heard music of guitars and stuff. I mean, the French loved to sit on these wide galleries, porches on the outside, and they had the joie de vivre, the good life.
Right. So talk about the food. What kind of food would the French have been?
We have. I've never found a recipe for anything from that time period or a receipt, as it is in French, but we do know of people that came through and wrote about it. A lot of travelers did. Wheat and corn were the predominant field crops. Melons, we know they had a very good melon here. They used Mother Nature a lot. The berries that were the blackberries, the wild cherries, the wild plums. One of my favorite stories is that the French always made wine, and a guy came through here in 1721, and he said that the vines grew 40 to 60 feet up in the air, and they would cut the tree down to get the grapes, and it was called making a vintage with a hatchet, which I thought was a clever turn,
Yes,
a clever phrase.
Yes.
Their gardens was a mixture of edible things and flowers. They'd like to have a pleasure garden as well. We know the French, from writings, really liked salads and herbs and that sort of thing. I mean, they were French. I mean, they did understand all that. They liked soups. And it was really, we have guys like Henry Breckenridge, who was here in the 1790s, saying that they had fricassees and gumbos. I think he said a dish that came from the Africans. So we were seeing that influence of different cultures here. Another guy, William C. Cart, was our first lawyer. He came in 1805, and he was writing, I think, to his sister-in-law, and he said, "Oh, the food is terrible. It's not roasted or fried. They have coffee, which is half milk, and it tastes like it's burnt." He said they most of the time they have soup and with very little meat in it, and just he didn't like any of the food that the French had. The other guys came through town. I think Thomas Shaw, who I mentioned, he said the coffee was as good as what he could find on Pont de Neuf in France.
And the river, of course, continues to be sustaining the town in terms of trade. So what type of boats would you typically see on the Mississippi during that period?
Well, back during that, you'd see a lot of flatboats and pirogues and stuff. I mean, we did trade with New Orleans and Natchez and that sort of thing. It would take about 3 weeks going down, and it'd take 3 months coming back, because you had to cordel them with ropes up the Mississippi. They had, in the early days, a lot of trouble with Native Americans attacking the boats, and they would have flotillas. There was one year, it's called the Year of the 10 Boats, because they sent 10 boats together down the river.
And you mentioned African Americans, of course, enslaved African Americans. They would be the ones that predominantly built the houses, correct? That provide and there were differences in terms of how they were treated here as opposed to how the British.
Well, I mean, enslaved people, it's not a good thing. I mean, they had some rules here that were different than on the American side or the British side. You know, slavery is never a good thing anyway. We had a lot more free blacks here, I would say. People could work on Sunday and earn their own freedom that way. And even before 1800, we see a number of free people of color.
And you see some interracial marriages, correct, here, that of course would not have been considered proper or permissible in the British colonies.
Well, they weren't considered permissible even in the Spanish either. They had rules against it, but that didn't stop it. I mean, and I think, you know, with the national park, we have 2 houses where there was a relationship. We've never found marriage records between a free woman of color and a true Frenchman. In both cases, a true Frenchman. Right. And so their descendants are still here around the United States, and they're descended from a Frenchman and a free woman of color. And that's more the 1830, 1840 time period.
Right.
So it's before emancipation.
Right, very good. Well, we're coming towards, we've got about 10 minutes left. Is there any particular topics I missed that you think would be important to highlight in your experience here?
Well, I think the fact that it's the, that part of history is not taught in America. We hear about the 13 colonies, the westward expansion, and unfortunately the French and the Spanish never put as many people in the frontier as the English did, but it's a part of American history, and it shouldn't be ignored. It should be taught, and that's something that we're trying to do here with our houses and our culture and some of our historic foods that we tend to make at different times during the year. Was talking to somebody the other day. The French made a dish called bouillon, and bouillon was taking an old hen and cooking it with vegetables, and you serve the broth separately, and then you could serve the chicken and the vegetables. But a bouillon is also a party, so it can be two things, and the Germans picked up on that. I mean, I grew up with bouillon, and we still make it at Christmas time. And so there are some things that with translation from that French to the German.
When did you first realize that St. Genevieve had some special history to it?
Well, I was actually living in Florida and retired. Well, I wasn't retired then, but I got interested in genealogy, so I started studying the history of my family and my wife's family, and found out that all of my ancestors, first generation American ancestors, lived in St. Genevieve County at one time or another. And after I retired, I was doing a lot of work on the Germans here. I got very interested in where did they come from, who they were, and I identified like 1,700 first-generation Germans that came.
Wow.
And then when we decided to get a place back here in St. Genevieve, a small place in the historic district, my dad was still alive here, and so we ended up selling our house in Florida and moving to a new house in St. Genevieve, one built in 1873. And I got interested being an engineer in the architecture that's here, but I soon realized with that genealogy background, there were people that lived here. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about these houses and the culture and everything, we're telling the story of people. And thank goodness we have a lot of records here. The French were good at writing things down. Our civil records go back to 1757, our church records back to 1759. Better learn to read French if you're going to be in them, but having that, I mean, they would have estate inventories when someone died, so you know what they had in their house. So it's kind of painting a picture of life then based on things that are in records. And I started finding out that the people here, the stories are so interesting and so different. I mean, we have true Frenchmen, we have French Canadians, we have African Americans, we have Native Americans. We've got Germans, we got Americans coming in. So telling those stories and discovering those stories of those people that lived in these houses, and actually those houses are still here.
And what you see is you have what America's become by seeing what St. Genevieve is in
Yes.
those early stages.
Yeah.
So, well, Bob, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it, and we'll pick this up in another conversation.
Sounds great.
All right, Don, I think that's it. Well, say you know your topic really well. So.
Well, I should say I should be indebted to people like Carl Eckberg and Jim Baker and other people that have written, those people, the travelers that came through here in the 1700s and 1800s.
If this tape turns out well, I'd like to, in the next session, I really would like to focus on the specific people, you know, the Guibourds, the Valets. I'd like to just go through those. But I don't think it would hurt to reach out to Jim and Carl and do interviews with them as well.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, these should
be...
be...
You know, Carl will be here for the
Oh.
history conference, but I think he'll probably be back for the Center for French Colonial Studies conference in October, too.